Welcome to Dear Fans. Karoline Leavitt walked into the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floor, the weight of unseen eyes pressing in around her. She was used to attention, but this was different, subtle, calculated, the kind of scrutiny that came not from curiosity, but from quiet assessment. She kept moving past the long lines of formals juggling luggage, past the businessmen absorbed in their calls, past the hurried travelers clutching their boarding passes. Like lifelines, the airport was alive with motion, a steady hum of voices and intercom announcements. Blending into a familiar backdrop at the check-in counter, the agent took her passport and ticket without a word. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, a flicker of something in the woman's eyes. She typed something extra into the system, a second too long, a glance over her shoulder, a quick forced smile. "Thank you, you're all set." Karoline didn't need to ask. She already knew security was next. The UAL steps, shoes off, laptop out, arms up in the scanner. The agent on the other side barely glanced at the screen before flagging her. Another pause. Another whisper to a colleague, another unnecessary check. "Step aside, please." She exhaled through her nose, controlled. It wasn't the first time, it wouldn't be the last. By the time she reached the gate, she was early, but the tension hadn't left. A low murmur rippled through the waiting area, an energy she couldn't quite place. Something was off. She felt it settle into her bones. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it. Then, just as she reached for a seat near the window, a shadow fell over her. "Miss Leavitt." The voice was firm, measured. She looked up. A uniformed airport officer stood before her, flanked by two others. "We need you to come with us." Karoline held her ground, her expression unreadable around her. The terminal continued its steady rhythm, boarding calls, rolling luggage, half conversations. But in the small pocket of space where she stood, time seemed to slow. "Why?" she asked, her voice calm. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at his colleagues, as if silently confirming something unspoken. Then, he looked back at her. "We need to verify some information." Vague, noncommittal, carefully worded. Karoline exhaled slowly, then glanced around. People were starting to notice. A businessman across the aisle frowned over his newspaper. A teenage girl near the charging station lifted her phone, slightly angling the camera toward them. The officer shifted. "Miss, if you could just come with us, we'll get this sorted quickly." She knew better. Nothing about this would be quick. Still, she nodded once and picked up her bag. The officers led her away from the gate, their formation subtle but deliberate. One slightly ahead, two behind. They weren't touching her. They didn't have to. The message was clear enough. As they walked, Karoline's mind raced. She had flown through this airport before, dozens of times, with no issues, no flags, no holds. So why now? They passed through a set of frosted glass doors marked authorized personnel, only stepping into a quiet hallway that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. The noise of the terminal faded behind them, replaced by the hollow echo of their footsteps at the end of the hall. A door. The officer in front swiped a key card, and the lock clicked open. Inside the room was small, windowless, a table with three chairs, a camera in the corner, its red light blinking. A vent hummed softly overhead, the only sound in the stillness. "Have a seat," the officer instructed. Karoline didn't move. She glanced at the doors had shut behind her, the finality of it settling like a weight in the air. Then she turned back to them. "You have no reason to hold me." The officer hesitated just for a second, then the mask slipped back into place. "This won't take long," he said. Karoline exhaled, slow and steady. She had a feeling he was wrong. She remained standing, her arms loosely crossed, her posture unreadable. The officers didn't rush her. They were waiting, letting the silence work against her. Karoline had been in enough high-press rooms to recognize the tactic. The longer she stood there, the heavier the moment became, pressing down like a weight meant to make her second-guess herself. But she didn't shift, didn't waver. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "Am I under arrest?" The lead officer, the one who had spoken before, didn't flinch. "No, ma'am, this is just a standard verification." "Verification of what exactly?" Again the small pause, barely noticeable, but there he glanced at the two other officers before responding. "We received an alert regarding your travel status." Karoline almost laughed. "An alert? Just a precaution," he said smoothly. "If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." She let that sit for a second, then slowly, deliberately, she pulled out her phone. Immediately the officer's expression tightened. "Miss Leavitt," she held up a hand, silencing him. Her thumb hovered over her screen. A single press, one call, that was all it would take. The officer's jaw clenched. He knew it too. She met his gaze, unwavering. "Who flagged me?" Another hesitation. He was weighing his options, trying to decide how much he could afford to then, before he could answer, a knock at the door, sharp, measured, the kind of knock that carried authority. The officers turned, exchanging brief glances. One of them stepped forward and opened the door. On the other side stood 6 men. Black suits, earpieces, a presence that made the air in the room shift. Karoline didn't need to be told who they were. Secret Service. The lead agent, a tall man with a controlled, almost effortless intensity, let his gaze sweep across the room before settling on her. Miss Leavitt, he said, his voice even. You're coming with us. The TSA officer bristled. We're in the middle of a security. You're done, the agent said flatly. The officer hesitated, but the shift in power was instant and absolute. No further argument. No further explanation. Karoline took one last look at the officers who had brought her here. Their silence told her everything she needed to know. Then, without another word, she stepped past them. The Secret Service agents closed in around her, their formation smooth, practiced. As she walked out of the room, the lead agent murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, this was never about security. She didn't react. She already knew. The hallway outside the interrogation room was silent, but charged. The air felt heavier now, like something unspoken had settled over the space. The Secret Service agents moved with quiet precision, forming a protective barrier around Karoline as they walked. No words were exchanged, none were needed. They led her through a separate corridor away from the public areas of the terminal. The further they moved from the gate, the more she felt the shift in control. Whatever had been in motion before, whatever game had been played at her expense, was now unraveling. She glanced at the lead agent walking beside her. He was focused ahead, his jaw set in a way that suggested this situation hadn't gone as planned for anyone. At the end of the corridor, a heavy security door stood closed. One of the agents swiped a key card, and the lock released. With a muted click beyond it, the atmosphere changed again. This was no longer the airport. The space opened into a private terminal, far quieter than the chaos she had left behind. A black SUV idled just outside, its tinted windows concealing whatever waited inside. More agents stood at attention nearby, their earpieces buzzing with muted conversations. She slowed her steps. Where are we going? The lead agent finally looked at her. Someplace secure. Karoline narrowed her eyes. I don't need protection. The agent expression didn't change. That's not up to you. A muscle in her jaw twitched, but she said nothing. She wasn't naive. Whatever this was, it had gone far beyond a simple security delay. Someone had flagged her, someone had made a decision, and now someone else had overruled it. The SUV door opened. Another agent, older, sharper, stepped out. He had the presence of someone who didn't waste time. I met his eyes. Who ordered this? A pause, then the White House. Her stomach tightened, not in fear, in realization. Whoever had tried to stop her from boarding that plane hadn't accounted for this. She exhaled slowly, schooling her expression back into unreadable neutrality. Then, without another word, she stepped into the car. The door shut behind her with a decisive thud. The convoy moved out, moments later disappearing into the city. The SUV moved smoothly through the streets, the hum of the engines steady, the world outside slipping past in a blur of lights and motion. Inside, Karoline sat still, her posture composed, but her mind sharp and restless. The lead agent sat across from her, his gaze unreadable. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just charged, like a coiled wire waiting to snap. Finally, she broke it. This was intentional. The agent didn't blink. Yes, she leaned forward slightly. Someone ordered me held back. Someone wanted me to miss that flight. Another pause. Then a measured response. Yes, she exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against her knee, but they underestimated the response. The agent tilted his head slightly, considering her. It was corrected. Karoline let out a soft, humorless laugh. That's one way to put it. The SUV turned, slowing slightly as it approached its destination. She glanced out the window. A discreet entrance, a building she recognized, not the White House, but close. She turned back to the agent who made the call this time. He did blink. You already know. She held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded. She did know. The car rolled to a stop outside. More agents waited, the door already being opened. Karoline smoothed the fabric of her jacket, then stepped out. The air was crisp, cool against her skin as she walked toward the entrance. She didn't look back. Whatever had happened at the airport was over, but whoever had tried to stop her, that was just beginning. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.